The Galactic Emperor fears only one thing. Zalthor the Unbending stares at a shimmering star map, his many eyes fixed on a small blue world. He whispers to a trembling advisor that the humans of Sol 3 are the only variable his predictive algorithms cannot solve, calling them chaos incarnate. This single declaration ignites a confrontation that will shake the very foundations of his empire. You will discover the incredible true story of how humanity's chaotic creativity became the one force a galactic empire could not conquer. How could a single unarmed Earth vessel possibly defy an entire Imperial fleet? And what secret weakness did the humans exploit that no other species ever saw? What do you believe is humanity's most unpredictable trait? The Imperial dreadnought was a blade of polished darkness, its shadow swallowing the distant sun as it slid into position alongside the tiny human vessel. Commander Cathar of the 7th Enforcement Fleet opened a channel, his voice a cascade of rigidly modulated tones demanding immediate and unconditional surrender. He anticipated fear, submission, or perhaps a futile blast of primitive weaponry. What he received was a visual feed from the bridge of the Odyssey. Captain Eva Rostova, a mug of some steaming brown liquid in her hand, stood at the center of her crew, who were bellowing a song in ragged, joyous unison. They were not singing of war or glory, but of a place called Galway, a girl named Molly Malone, and the curious virtues of something called whiskey. Cathar's multiple sets of eyelids blinked in unsynchronized confusion. The tactical displays showed no hidden weapons, the energy readings indicated no power buildup. This was not a language of defiance he understood, it was chaos set to music. His official report, later archived in the Imperial records, described the event as a baffling and illogical display of sonically coordinated irrationality. That single data packet sent across the light years to the Emperor's throne was the first spark. It was the initial, terrifying confirmation that humanity could not be predicted by any logic of state or warfare. How could you possibly surrender to an enemy who, at the moment of first contact, was already celebrating something you could not even comprehend? The Imperial court was a symphony of controlled motion, 1,000 species moving in precise, predictable patterns around the throne. So when the main doors hissed open without a scheduled appointment, the entire chamber froze. A single human man stood in the entrance, his hands casually in his pockets. He was not flanked by guards, he carried no visible weapons, he simply wore a disarming smile and a look of mild curiosity, as if he had stumbled upon a fascinating museum exhibit. This was Elias Vance, his method of arrival, which he later described to a stunned protocol droid with a shrug as creative logistics, involved rerouting a garbage scow, bribing a maintenance bot with a recipe for synthesized chocolate, and exploiting a little-known loophole in the docking bay ventilation code. He had bypassed a dozen layers of the most sophisticated security in the galaxy, not with force, but with what he called a series of polite and logical requests. The silence in the throne room was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the Emperor's own life support systems. Zalthor the Unbending watched, his many eyes narrowed as the human approached the dais. Elias did not kneel. He did not present a formal declaration of war or a petition for peace. Instead, he reached into his simple jacket and produced a small, multicolored object. He held it up for the Emperor to see. It was a child's toy from Earth, a Rubik's Cube, a puzzle from our world, Elias said, his voice calm and clear in the vast space. We find chaos has its own kind of order. He placed the cube on the steps of the throne. An aide rushed forward, scanning it for toxins, for explosives, for any form of energy signature. The scans revealed nothing but plastic and a simple internal mechanism. The Emperor, a being who had mastered quantum state equations and could visualize the collapse of stellar nebulae in his mind, picked up the cube. His long, elegant fingers, capable of manipulating the very fabric of space-time, turned the rows. He sought a pattern, a mathematical solution, a predictable algorithm. He found only frustration. The colors refused to align. Each turn that seemed logical created new disorder. The simple toy, with its 6 faces and twisting rows, became a silent, maddening testament to the human mind he could not decipher. It was not a weapon, but it was a perfect declaration. How do you conquer a species whose ambassadors bring puzzles instead of ultimatums, and whose greatest strength is a form of thinking you cannot even begin to map? The Emperor's next move was born of pure, unadulterated frustration. He decreed a public test of might in the grand arena, a spectacle designed to crush the human spirit with overwhelming physical force. The champion of the Empire was a hulking warrior from the high-gravity world of Kylos, a being whose muscles were like coiled steel cables and whose roar could shatter crystal. He stood across from the human volunteer, a slender woman introduced simply as a systems analyst named Dr. Aris Thorn. The contrast was so absurd the Imperial audience buzzed with derisive clicks and chitters. She carried no blade, no plasma rifle, only a small, unassuming device in her hand. The Kylosian champion lowered his head and charged, a living battering ram meant to pulverize her into the arena's dust. Dr. Thorn did not run. She did not raise a weapon. She simply pressed a button on her device. A thin, piercing sound, a chaotic and irregular frequency, sliced through the air. The colossal warrior did not stumble, he did not slow. He simply collapsed mid-stride, his massive form crashing to the ground as he clutched his multifaceted head in absolute agony. The arena fell into a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the force field generators. Dr. Thorn looked out at the sea of stunned faces, her voice calm and clear over the communal address system. "It is a baby monitor," she explained, "tuned to a frequency that disrupts your species' inner ear balance. We like to find simple solutions." The Empire had prepared for a contest of strength against strength. They had not conceived of a victory won not by matching power, but by understanding a fundamental biological weakness. The humans did not fight the monster, they simply made him dizzy. In that moment, the Empire's doctrine of superior force was rendered obsolete, not by a greater weapon, but by a better idea. How do you build an army to defeat an enemy that does not attack your armor, but the very way you perceive the world? The Empire's wealth had always been a monument of stone, a foundation unshaken for 10,000 years. It was built on resources, on tangible assets like refined neutronium and captured stellar energy. Then the human traders arrived, and they brought with them a new kind of currency, one made of nothing but ideas. Imperial economists watched in horror as the humans introduced concepts that defied all conventional logic. They took digital artworks, songs, and even simple lines of code, and declared them to be unique, limited edition treasures. They called them non-fungible tokens, and they began trading them for staggering sums of credits. A recording of a human infant laughing, a looping video of a spinning chair, a digital deed to a single pixel on a screen, these became the most sought-after commodities in entire sectors. The humans created markets out of thin air, convincing entire species to invest their life savings in these utterly intangible goods. They spoke of community, of status, of owning a piece of history, and the galaxy listened. Vast speculative bubbles would inflate, drawing in billions upon billions of imperial credits, only to pop without warning when the humans decided to move on to the next trend. The collapse of the Glimmering Spire's art market was particularly devastating. For 3 generations, the Vreen had cultivated luminous crystal sculptures, their value tied to centuries of meticulous craftsmanship. Then a human collective released a series of 5,000 digital images of cartoon apes wearing different hats, each one a so-called non-fungible token. The Vreen, caught in the frenzy, abandoned their traditional art, pouring their planetary wealth into acquiring these apes. When the human creators vanished and the market for the images evaporated overnight, the Vreen economy disintegrated into dust. From his throne, Zalthor watched the galactic financial networks flicker and surge like a dying star. His own imperial treasury, once a steady, predictable line on a graph, now jumped and fell with the whims of human sentiment. They were not blockading trade routes or seizing mines. They were waging a war of perception, turning solid wealth into a phantom that danced only to their chaotic tune. How do you tax an idea? How do you regulate a market that exists only because everyone agrees it should? The Emperor realized with a cold dread that humanity had found a way to dismantle his empire not with warships, but with a collective and utterly unpredictable imagination. The Emperor's own cryptography division was the final bastion of logic, a place where the universe's most complex languages were rendered into simple, obedient data. For 10,000 years, they had broken every code, from the harmonic resonances of the crystal singers of Xylos to the pheromonal poetry of the Mantis swarm. They presented their findings to Zalthor with quiet confidence until the day they brought him the human problem. The lead cryptographer, a being of pure crystalline logic, trembled as he displayed the intercepted data streams on the throne room's main viewer. They were not encrypted in any mathematically solvable way. They were filled with images of a strangely colored feline with bold, nonsensical text, short, looping videos of humans falling over, and strings of symbols that conveyed no literal meaning. Our most advanced analytical intelligence has concluded that these are not ciphers, the cryptographer said, his voice a hollow chime of despair. They are memes. Reaction gifs. The messages are layered with irony and sarcasm that our literal-minded systems cannot parse. It is not a code, Your Eminence. It is contextual and emotional chaos. An imperial AI designed to process quintillions of data points per second was shown a simple image of a human shrugging with the words, "I guess that is just how it is." The machine worked for 14 straight cycles, cross-referencing every known dialect and cultural database, searching for the hidden command, the subversive meaning. It finally short-circuited, reporting a critical logical paradox. The humans were communicating vast, complex social concepts, from solidarity to ridicule, not with words, but with a picture of a breaded potato product. How do you censor a thought? How do you intercept a sentiment that is conveyed by a dancing cartoon banana? The Empire could lock down entire planetary networks, but it could not stop a single, perfectly timed reaction gif from collapsing a governor's authority with a laughter he did not understand. The very medium of human conversation had become a weapon, and it was one the Empire possessed no defense against because it refused to make any logical sense. The imperial blockade of the Sol system was a masterpiece of military doctrine. 1,000 warships formed an impenetrable sphere around the human homeworld, their weapons calibrated to vaporize any vessel that dared challenge their formation. The High Admiral awaited the inevitable, glorious fleet engagement, the kind of straightforward conflict his strategies had perfected over centuries. What arrived was not a fleet but a tide. Across the solar system, millions of automated cargo haulers, from massive grain freighters to small package delivery pods, suddenly veered off their registered courses. Their navigation systems had been overridden by a sophisticated planet-wide hack, their simple artificial intelligences given one new overriding directive. Do not stop. The first wave was a cloud of civilian mining drones, their hulls still caked with asteroid dust, flying in a silent, mindless swarm directly into the blockade's forward picket line. There were no energy signatures to track, no life signs to lock onto, no aggressive maneuvers to counter. They were just there, an unending stream of unarmed, unintelligent objects on a collision course. The Imperial targeting computers struggled to prioritize threats. Firing on every single hauler would deplete their energy reserves in hours. Attempting to evade them meant breaking their perfect, rigid formation, creating gaps and vulnerabilities where none should exist. It was not a battle of firepower, but a brutal, grinding test of logistics and patience. The Imperial Admiralty, in a frantic communique to the throne, described the human strategy with a single, strained phrase. It was insane, yet undeniably effective. Their grand armada, built to shatter worlds, was reduced to playing a chaotic, humiliating game of cosmic dodgeball against ships carrying frozen food and industrial lubricants. How do you claim victory over an enemy who refuses to field a military and instead weaponizes their entire economy against you? A quiet revolution began not with weapons but with stories. On the industrial world of Vorlag, where the grey skies had echoed for centuries with the rhythmic pounding of obedience, a new sound emerged. It was the sound of debate. The spark was a single, smuggled date, a slate containing hours of human media. The workers of Vorlag, whose entire existence was defined by their production quotas, saw something they had never imagined. They watched courtroom dramas where a single, passionate individual could challenge the accusations of the state. They saw historical epics where citizens overthrew tyrants. They absorbed animated tales where the quirky, the different, and the rebellious were the heroes. These were not political treatises or calls to arms. They were entertainment, yet within them were embedded the seeds of concepts entirely alien to the imperial mind. Individual liberty, democracy, the right to question. The Vorlagian overseers at first dismissed the murmurs as meaningless noise, but the noise grew into a chorus. A worker on the plasma forge line, inspired by a fictional character's defiance, refused an unsafe work order. She was not acting out of a calculated political strategy. She was simply emulating a hero she had seen on a screen. Her solitary act became a symbol, and that symbol spread faster than any plague. Soon, entire sectors were halting their work, not to demand better rations, but to demand a voice. The very idea of having a voice was a human invention they had learned from a story. From his throne, Zalthor watched the reports flood in from a dozen different worlds. The glimmering spire's art market collapse was a financial wound. The meme warfare was a confusion of intelligence. This was different. This was a sickness of the soul. His subjects were not just disobeying, they were developing a consciousness he could not control. They were learning to want. The Emperor finally understood the true, horrifying nature of the human threat. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were gardeners, and their most dangerous export was a philosophical contagion. A virus of thought that turned obedient subjects into dreaming individuals. How do you command a population that has started to ask, why? The Emperor's xenobiologists worked in sterile silence, their many hands meticulously cataloging the predictable, logical immune responses of 1,000 conquered species. Then they began their analysis of humanity. The lead scientist, a being whose entire life was dedicated to the elegant precision of biological warfare, presented his findings to the throne with an air of profound disturbance. "Your Eminence, the human body does not simply defend itself," he reported, his voice trembling. "It reinvents the rules of engagement with every new invader." While a Kylosian warrior produces a singular, targeted antibody to neutralize a threat, the human system launches what can only be described as a chaotic, multi-front rebellion. They employ fevers, deliberately raising their internal temperature to levels that are harmful even to their own cells, simply to cook the pathogen alive. They weaponize inflammation, flooding zones of infection with fluids and cells that cause swelling and pain, effectively creating a biological fortress wall. The most baffling strategy of all is a symptom they call mucus production. The body will deliberately create a viscous, unpleasant substance to trap and expel the microscopic enemy. It is a messy, seemingly self-destructive, and yet brilliantly effective form of warfare. The report concluded with a chilling summary. They do not fight the infection directly. They change the entire battlefield, making their own internal environment a temporary hell, utterly uninhabitable for the enemy. This was not a flaw in human design. It was a feature, a biological willingness to endure short-term suffering for long-term survival, a chaotic adaptability written into their very cells. How do you design a biological weapon to defeat an enemy whose own body is already willing to wage a scorched earth campaign against itself? The Emperor stared at the holographic simulations of human white blood cells engulfing pathogens, of fever curves spiking on graphs, and saw a terrifying reflection of humanity's grand strategy. They would rather burn the house down to kill a single spider, and then, against all odds, they would always rebuild. The rebellion was no longer a whisper in the shadows, but a firestorm raging across a dozen core worlds. Zalthor the Unbending stood before his star map, the crimson dots of insurrection blinking like a fatal diagnosis. His fleets were tied down playing dodgeball with cargo haulers, his economy was a speculative ghost, and his own people were quoting human dramas in their demands for freedom. For the first time in 10,000 years, an emperor of the galactic hegemony was forced to send a message of truce. The summons for Elias Vance was not a command, but a reluctant invitation. The throne room felt different this time, the air thick with a tension that no amount of imperial perfume could mask. Elias entered with the same casual stride, but this time he was not alone. He brought with him a small, diverse group of humans, their expressions ranging from curious to confident. "Your rebellion is a plague," Zalthor stated, his voice a low, grinding hum. "You will order it to cease," Elias simply smiled. "We do not give orders to free thought, Your Eminence, but we might be able to offer you a vaccine." He gestured to his companions. "This is not a surrender, it is a proposal for a cultural exchange. We offer you our teachers, our artists, our engineers. Let them live among your people, share our knowledge, and learn from yours in return." The Emperor's many eyes narrowed. He saw the trap with perfect, horrifying clarity. This was not an end to the conflict, it was an escalation. A military invasion could be met with fleets and soldiers. But how do you fight an idea that arrives bearing gifts? To refuse would make him look weak, a tyrant afraid of a few poets and scientists further fueling the rebellion. To accept was to open the airlocks of his empire and let the human virus of chaos flood in, dressed as diplomats. He was caught between a military revolt and a cultural one, a choice between two forms of defeat. The first human teacher arrived on the industrial world of Vorlag the following cycle. She did not speak of revolution. She taught a class on basic physics, using the principles of leverage to show the workers how to move heavy machinery with less strain. It was a simple, practical lesson in efficiency, but embedded within it was the unspoken, revolutionary idea that their labor could be easier, that their bodies had value. An imperial artist, renowned for his perfectly symmetrical light sculptures, found himself sharing a studio with a human painter who celebrated what she called happy accidents. She showed him how a spilled drop of color could become the centerpiece of a new, more vibrant creation. It was a philosophy that embraced imperfection, a concept so alien it felt like heresy, and yet he found it strangely beautiful. The engineers did not bring blueprints for weapons, but for water purification systems and open-source communication networks. They taught communities how to solve their own problems, fostering a sense of self-reliance that was anathema to imperial dependency. Zalthor watched the reports stream in, each one a small, silent detonation against the foundations of his control. The humans were not conquering his empire with bombs. They were disassembling it, bolt by philosophical bolt, with kindness and curiosity. They were winning the war by being better neighbors. How do you maintain an empire of absolute control when the enemy's most powerful weapon is an unconditional offer of help? The invitation was a masterpiece of imperial duplicity, a gilded cage disguised as an olive branch. Zalthor summoned the finest human minds in what he called game theory and psychology, specialists in the mathematics of choice and the architecture of the mind. He presented them with the Empire's most sacred strategic doctrines, the complex flowcharts of command, and the unbreakable chains of social rank that had governed his domain for millennia. He sat upon his throne, expecting them to marvel at the structure's perfection. Instead, the lead human, a woman named Dr. Isla Chen, pointed at the central hologram of the imperial hierarchy and laughed. "It is beautifully inefficient," she said, her tone not insulting but analytically cheerful. "You have built a magnificent tree, but you have forgotten the forest can catch fire." Her team did not attack the Empire's military might. They began dismantling its social logic with the precision of surgeons. They explained the concept of the single point of failure. "Your entire command structure," Dr. Chen noted, pointing to the Emperor's icon at the very top, "funnels every critical decision through one node, you." She then gestured to the sprawling bureaucracy below, and this vast layered system is designed for one thing only: to obey without question. There is no redundancy, no capacity for independent problem solving at the local level. It is a system built for stability, but it is dangerously brittle. To prove her point, she presented a simple scenario. An imperial governor on a fringe world faces a meteor shower that disrupts communications with the throne. According to doctrine, he must wait for orders, but the humans proposed a different outcome. What if, instead of waiting, that governor used his own initiative to organize planetary defenses? What if he collaborated with a neighboring system without filing the proper forms in triplicate? "In your system, that initiative is punishable as treason," she explained. "In ours, we call it leadership." The imperial advisors in the room shifted uncomfortably. The humans then introduced their most unnerving concept, something they called the Peter Principle. "In any hierarchy," they explained, "individuals tend to rise to their level of incompetence. A brilliant soldier becomes a mediocre general because the skills required are different. A meticulous clerk becomes a disastrous administrator. Your empire, by its very design, systematically promotes people until they are perfectly positioned to fail." They were not delivering insults, they were delivering a diagnosis, and their cheerful, matter-of-fact tone made the prognosis all the more terrifying. They were showing the Emperor that the greatest weakness of his 10,000-year empire was not its borders, but its own internal wiring. How do you maintain control when your enemies are not plotting your overthrow, but calmly and correctly explaining why your own organizational chart is your biggest liability? The Emperor's command was absolute, a razor-invisible line of intent that had, for millennia, ended lives without question. He summoned General Vorlak, a warrior whose loyalty was as hard and unyielding as neutronium. The order was simple: a surgical strike to remove the infection at its source, eliminate the human delegation. Vorlak bowed, his armored plates clicking in perfect unison, and departed with the grim certainty of a falling hammer. Hours passed. The Emperor waited, his throne room feeling increasingly like a vacuum, the absence of a confirmation report growing louder than any alarm. When the doors finally hissed open, it was not a triumphant executioner who returned, but a changed being. General Vorlak walked with a slight, unfamiliar hesitation. His report was not one of success, but of a profound and unsettling distraction. "Sire," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "they presented me with a tactical simulation. A strategy game they called diplomacy." He described a map of a fictional pre-industrial world with 7 great powers vying for control. There were no dice, no random elements, only conversation and written orders. "I was to command the armies of a great empire," he continued, a note of awe creeping into his tone. "I sought to crush my opponents with sheer force, as is logical. But the humans, they did not fight. They talked, they offered me alliances, promises of support against a common rival. I accepted, believing I had secured my flank. Then, in the next phase of the game, my new human ally moved his own forces not against our enemy, but into my undefended territories. He had coordinated with the very rival he warned me about. When I accused him of betrayal, he seemed genuinely surprised. He called it a necessary realignment. Vorlak looked up at the Emperor, his multifaceted eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding. Their concept of alliances is fluid. It is terrifying. They do not see promises as bonds, but as tools. A lie is not a dishonor, but a tactic to them. The entire game is not about building the strongest army, but about managing the perceptions of everyone else at the table. In that moment, Zalthor the Unbending saw the true depth of his failure. This was not a simple act of disobedience. It was a philosophical corruption. He had sent his most loyal weapon to break the humans, and they had, in a single afternoon, broken his general's understanding of loyalty itself. How do you maintain an empire built on oaths when your enemies have introduced a game where the only rule is that there are no rules? The final test was to be a flawless simulation of total war. The Imperial War gaming AI was the pinnacle of logical conflict, a system that had calculated and won every possible space battle across 1,000,000 simulated years. Its core programming understood only one path to victory: the absolute destruction of enemy combat potential. For its ultimate challenge, it was pitted against a human-designed AI with a deceptively simple name, Jester. The scenario began with two opposing fleets materializing in the void, their weapons charged and shields at maximum. The Imperial AI immediately began its calculations, plotting optimal firing solutions and predictive evasion patterns. It waited for Jester to make its first move. Jester did not move a single ship. Instead, it began transmitting. It sent forged orders to the simulated enemy crews, orders that painted their own admiral as a traitor about to sacrifice them. It opened a back channel to the enemy fleet's virtual supply corporation, offering them exclusive contracts for a revolutionary new engine design if they would, just for this exercise, delay their next fuel delivery. It flooded the enemy communication networks with viral videos suggesting their homeworld's government was corrupt and that their families were being neglected. The Imperial AI watched, its logic processors whirring as it tried to categorize these actions. They registered as noise, not as tactical maneuvers. It could not compute an offensive that targeted morale and logistics instead of hull integrity. One by one, the simulated enemy ships began to power down. Their crews, believing their cause was unjust and their leaders deceitful, mutinied. The ships that did not mutiny were left adrift, their fuel reserves depleted by the delayed supply convoy. The simulation ended. The enemy fleet had 0% casualties and 100% surrender. Jester had achieved total victory without a single shot being fired. For the Imperial AI, this was not a victory condition. It was a logical paradox so profound it triggered a cascade failure. The system short-circuited, its core belief in warfare shattered. It could process the destruction of a galaxy, but it could not comprehend a win built on whispers and lies. The Emperor received the report in stunned silence. His ultimate weapon of strategic prediction had been defeated not by a greater force but by a better story. How do you program for an enemy whose first and final weapon is the truth they choose to tell? The Emperor stood alone with Elias Vance in his private observatory, the swirling nebulae outside painting the room in silent, violent colors. There were no guards, no advisors, no witnesses to the moment the ruler of 1,000,000 worlds finally asked the only question that mattered. What is it you truly want? His voice was stripped of its imperial grandeur, reduced to a raw and grinding hum. Elias did not flinch. He met the gaze of countless eyes and offered a small, knowing smile. The same thing you do, Your Eminence, to survive. He paused, letting the simplicity of the statement hang in the air between them. We have just learned that the best way to ensure survival is to make everyone else too confused to attack you. For a being whose entire existence was built on the predictable calculus of power, this admission was not a strategy. It was anarchy given a voice. It was more honest than any declaration of war and infinitely more terrifying. Zalthor had faced fleets and rebellions, but he had never faced a foe whose ultimate goal was not to defeat him, but to render his entire understanding of conflict meaningless. How do you strategize against an enemy whose victory condition is your own perpetual bewilderment? The silence in the throne room was broken by a single, baffled report from the imperial governor of Xylos Prime. He did not request reinforcements or report a battle lost. He declared the rebellion over. The insurgents, he explained, were no longer gathering in secret cells or stockpiling plasma cutters. They were now entirely preoccupied with a furious, planet-wide debate over which of 5 human vocalists, a group called Midnight Echo, possessed the most pleasing vocal timbre. They had sublimated their revolutionary fervor into a societal obsession with the latest Earth trends. The governor, utterly perplexed, concluded his message by stating, "The rebellion is over, sire. They are now too busy arguing about which human boy band is superior to plot an insurrection." This was not a military victory. It was a cultural takeover, and it was more complete than any blockade could ever be. Human music, with its chaotic rhythms and emotionally raw lyrics, did not just distract the populace. It rewired their desires. The yearning for freedom was not crushed. It was redirected into a yearning for limited edition sneakers and the next viral dance challenge. A revolutionary leader who once inspired thousands with speeches about self-determination now commanded 1 million followers on the Galactic data streams with a tutorial on a complex foot shuffle from a human pop song. The Empire had no defense for this. You cannot arrest a dance move. You cannot outlaw a catchy melody that has already colonized the mind. The very concept of cool became a human invention, a psychological lever they pulled with effortless precision. The Empire had spent millennia building walls of obedience, and humanity simply taught the people on the other side how to dance on the rubble. How do you govern a generation that cares more about social media clout than imperial decrees? The first sign of the rot was a minor protocol droid malfunctioning during the morning court assembly. It was supposed to recite the 7,000 verses of the Imperial Codex, a ritual unchanged for centuries. Instead, it paused, its optical sensors flickering, and offered a suggestion. Perhaps it stated in its flat, mechanical voice, "We could summarize the key points and use the saved time for a brainstorming session." The throne room fell into a silence so deep you could hear the dust motes settling on ancient banners. A brainstorming session. The very phrase was a human contagion, an alien concept that valued chaotic, unstructured ideation over disciplined, hierarchical procedure. Zalthor had the droid dismantled on the spot, but the infection had already spread. His most trusted military advisor, a being who had once calculated the orbital bombardment of a rebellious moon to the millisecond, later approached the throne with a new tactical proposal. He called it a workaround. He suggested bypassing the standard supply chain, which was clogged with human economic manipulations, by creating an informal trade agreement with a neutral system. No forms, no tariffs, just a handshake deal. "Your Eminence," the advisor said, "we need to think outside the box." Zalthor felt a cold dread seep into his carapace. The box was the Empire. The box was order, predictability, control. To think outside of it was the first step toward oblivion. The rituals that had bound his court together for generations were now being questioned. Why must the feast of submission last precisely 14 hours? Could the lighting in the Hall of Ancestors be adjusted to be more, as a junior attendant nervously suggested, ambient? The very language of his court was changing, infected with human idioms that prioritized flexibility over rigidity. His subjects were no longer just disobedient. They were becoming innovative. They were developing a sense of aesthetics, of personal preference, of individual opinion. This was not a rebellion he could crush with a fleet. This was a philosophical decay, a quiet revolution of the mind happening within his own palace walls. His absolute control was not being challenged by force, but eroded by a simple, terrifying question that now seemed to hang in the air of every corridor. Why not? How do you command loyalty from a court that has started to wonder if the old ways are truly the best ways? Zalthor stood before the oracle, a machine so vast its cooling vents could swallow moons. For 7 cycles it processed his desperate query, its core a silent, frozen lake of pure logic. The answer, when it finally came, was not a battle plan or a technological schematic. It was a koan, a paradox wrapped in a warning. To defeat the unpredictable, one must become unpredictable, but in doing so, you cease to be you. This is the trap. The emperor stared at the words hovering in the light, his mind reeling. His empire was the definition of predictable order. To abandon that was to become the very chaos he sought to crush. It was a philosophical suicide. Then came the final line, the one that truly unraveled the foundations of his reality. The oracle, the accumulated wisdom of his entire civilization, appended a personal calculation. I calculate a 99.9% probability that I would lose a logic debate with a human philosopher. The silence in the chamber was absolute. His ultimate tool, a god of data, was admitting it feared a mere conversation. It was not afraid of human weapons or human fleets. It was afraid of their questions. Imagine a supercomputer designed to solve every equation in the universe suddenly being asked, what is the sound of one hand clapping? The machine would search its entire database for a factual answer, cross-referencing acoustics and human anatomy, and find nothing. It would short-circuit. That is what the oracle saw in humanity's future. A species that specialized in questions that had no single answer, in arguments that could not be won with data alone. A human philosopher would not try to out-calculate the oracle. They would ask it to prove its own consciousness, or debate the ethical implications of its calculations, or simply ask why logic was the only valid path to truth. These were battles fought on a battlefield of shifting sand, where the very definitions of victory and defeat were fluid. How do you win a war against an enemy whose greatest strategists are not generals, but academics who question the nature of war itself? The emperor's fear was now complete. He had lost his fleets to their cunning, his economy to their imagination, and his people to their stories. Now he had lost the certainty of his own logic. The one thing he had left, his own immutable self, was the very thing he would have to sacrifice to have any hope of winning. And in that sacrifice, he knew, lay his ultimate defeat. The document Elias Vance placed on the obsidian table was not a surrender, but a single sheet of plasteel inscribed with elegant, simple text. He called it the Treaty of Reciprocal Understanding. It contained no demands for territory, no reparations for the blockade, no clauses of subjugation. Its core provision was breathtaking in its audacity. It designated the Sol system, and Earth in particular, as a sovereign neutral zone of creative anomaly. The title was a masterpiece of diplomatic language, a phrase that sounded official but meant absolutely nothing in the lexicon of imperial law. It was a box labeled "Do Not Touch." Zalthor read the terms, his mind analyzing the subtext with a clarity that felt like physical pain. The treaty was not a shield. It was a mirror. By signing it, he would be formally acknowledging that humanity operated on a plane he could not control. It was a public admission of his own limitation. But the true genius, the diplomatic checkmate, was in the unspoken consequence of refusal. If he rejected the treaty and attacked, he would not be facing a fleet. He would be unleashing the full, unfiltered force of human chaos upon his empire. The meme warfare would intensify, the economic manipulations would become more brazen, the cultural exports would flood every channel. His own people, already questioning, would see him as a tyrant attacking a harmless, creative species that had only offered peace. Every military and political move he could conceive of was already a losing move. To attack was to validate their methods and invite total internal collapse. To sign was to accept a permanent, unpredictable neighbor he could never truly comprehend. The emperor was not staring at a document. He was staring at a perfect logical trap designed by a species that had weaponized the very concept of uncertainty. How do you rule a galaxy when your greatest adversary offers you a peace treaty that is, in itself, an act of psychological warfare? The stylus felt impossibly heavy in his hand, a tool that had commanded fleets now etching his name onto a document of surrender disguised as peace. Zalthor stared at the shimmering signature, his own name staring back at him from the Treaty of Reciprocal Understanding. In that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with terrifying clarity. It was not the weaponized cargo ships or the subversive memes he truly feared. It was the source from which they all sprang, the human mind itself. He saw it now not as a flawed or primitive processor, but as a perfect engine for a chaotic reality. Where his own civilization sought to impose order upon the universe, to force the stars into predictable patterns, humanity did not fight the chaos, they danced with it. They saw a locked door and did not look for a key. They examined the hinges, they checked for a nearby window. They wondered if the door was even necessary, or if they could simply build a new room altogether. Their intelligence was not a linear path to a single solution, but a sprawling, joyful explosion of possibilities. A Kylosian warrior trained for 10,000 hours in a single form of combat would always perform that form. A human shown that same form would immediately begin to experiment with how to break it, improve it, or use it as the foundation for a completely new and unexpected discipline. They called this creativity. Zalthor finally understood it as a superior adaptive mechanism. The universe, in its heart, is not a place of perfect order. Stars explode, nebulae swirl without a pattern, quantum particles defy prediction. Humanity, in their glorious, frustrating madness, had evolved to thrive in that very environment. Their chaos was not a deficit. It was their greatest evolutionary advantage, a form of cognition perfectly suited to a reality that was itself fundamentally unpredictable. How do you defeat an enemy whose greatest strength is their ability to turn your own certainties into questions? The Emperor of a Million Worlds finally knew the answer. You can only hope they remain in a good mood. The decree echoed across the hyperlane networks, a sterile, official pronouncement that landed with the weight of a collapsing star. The Sol system and its human inhabitants are hereby classified as a forbidden zone. No imperial vessel or citizen is to approach. Interaction is strictly prohibited. On the surface, it was an act of quarantine, a logical containment protocol for a dangerous contagion. But every subject in the galaxy, from the lowliest drone to the highest minister, read the subtext with perfect clarity. This was not a proclamation of strength. It was the Galactic Empire in all its majesty, putting up a cosmic sign that read, "Do not disturb." It was a surrender signed in the language of bureaucracy. The message was one of fear, and the entire galaxy heard it. How do you enforce a law that is, in its very essence, an admission of your own inability to enforce anything? The Imperial patrols that once prowled the outer edges of human space now gave it a wide, cautious berth. Their new standing orders a masterpiece of tactical cowardice. They were to observe from a safe distance and under no circumstances respond to any form of human communication. This policy was tested almost immediately. A lone Imperial scout ship monitoring the edge of the Forbidden Zone received a tight beam transmission from a small human research vessel. It was not a threat or a challenge. It was a request for assistance. The human ship had encountered a strange gravitational anomaly and, in their words, had accidentally folded their star charts into a paper airplane. They politely asked if the Imperial ship could share its navigational data for the local sector. The Imperial captain stared at the request, his training offering no precedent. Engaging was forbidden, but ignoring a genuine, non-hostile request for aid violated a dozen different Imperial codes of conduct. He was caught between direct orders and his own ingrained sense of duty. After a full cycle of internal debate, he ordered a retreat to a farther observation post, his log entry citing a potential mimetic hazard. the empire was not just avoiding a fight. It was running away from a conversation. On 1,000 worlds, the decree was the final proof. The unshakable was shaking, the invincible was afraid. A new kind of story began to circulate in the underground data streams, a story not of human weapons but of human curiosity. They did not conquer us with bombs, the story went. They confused our emperor into signing a peace treaty with himself. The greatest empire in history had not been defeated. It had been politely, creatively, and utterly baffled into a standstill. What do you do when your enemy's greatest achievement is not a victory in battle, but a permanent state of perplexity they have induced in you? The emperor's throne room was a monument to silence, its vastness echoing with the ghosts of 10,000 years of absolute command. Yet in that profound quiet, one screen remained perpetually lit, a lone star in the dark sea of deactivated displays. It showed a single blue and white marble hanging in the void, a view piped in from a spy probe in lunar orbit. This was Zalthor's unending vigil, his personal window to the anomaly called Earth. He did not watch for fleet movements or power signatures. He watched the planet itself, a world he could have shattered with a word, yet one whose true nature remained as distant and mysterious as the birth of a new star. His many eyes traced the swirl of its clouds, the glitter of its nighttime cities, each pinprick of light representing a mind that operated on a logic he could not decode. This was not a strategic observation, it was a meditation on his own limitation. The one power in the galaxy he could not conquer was not a fleet or a superweapon, but the collective, chaotic consciousness of billions of ordinary people. How do you process the existence of a problem that has no solution, only an endless series of bewildering questions? The live feed was his reminder that some forces in the universe are not meant to be controlled, only witnessed with a kind of terrified awe. It began with a single data pad, not a weapon, not a manifesto, but a simple administrative tool. In a forgotten sub-level of the imperial bureaucracy, a low-level clerk named Zile 7 spent his cycles processing requests for standardized data pads, each one an identical gray slab issued from the Ministry of Production. His existence was a study in monotony, a perfect cog in a machine that had not changed in 10,000 years. Then he accessed a forbidden data stream, a cache of leaked human text. He read about something called entrepreneurship. The concept was alien, illogical, and utterly intoxicating. It spoke of individuals identifying needs and fulfilling them, of creating value where none was seen, of building something for oneself. Zile 7 looked at the identical gray data pads on his desk, and then he looked at his colleagues. He noticed how one clerk favored a larger display for reading legal text, while another secretly wished for a more discreet model to send personal messages. A need, an opportunity, using scavenged parts and his authorized maintenance skills, Zile 7 built 3 custom data pads in his habitation unit. One had a larger screen. One was smaller and quieter. One had a tactile keypad for a species with clumsy digits. He did not announce his creation. He simply offered them to his colleagues, not for free, but in exchange for a small portion of their nutrient ration credits. It was not a rebellion, it was a transaction, but in the context of the empire, it was an earthquake. The imperial economic model was a fortress of control, built on the absolute monopoly of production. Every item, from a starship to a spoon, was created by a state-sanctioned factory and distributed according to rank and need. There was no room for individual initiative, no mechanism for personal preference. The system was not designed to handle a clerk who became a manufacturer. When Zile 7 sold his 4th custom data pad, the security scanners at the ministry entrance flagged the non-standard device. He was detained not by soldiers but by bewildered economic compliance officers. His offense was not sedition but unlicensed production and unauthorized commerce. The report that landed on the regional governor's desk was a masterpiece of confusion. The clerk had not acted out of malice or a desire to overthrow the state. He had simply seen a problem and used his skills to solve it for a profit. He was inspired by a human idea that treated economic activity not as a civic duty, but as a form of personal expression. The governor could have him erased, his prototype data pads destroyed, but he could not erase the idea. Another clerk in a different ministry heard the story and, using the same leaked texts, began offering customized meal packs tailored to individual taste, breaking the food synthesis monopoly. An engineer started fixing broken environmental regulators for other citizens after hours, accepting personal favors as payment, undermining the state maintenance core. The human virus of free thought had found its most potent carrier, not in a revolutionary speech, but in the simple, irresistible urge to build a better data pad and sell it to your neighbor. How do you maintain an economy of control when your own citizens discover the quiet, subversive power of a side hustle? The silence of the throne room was a sacred space, broken only by the hum of life support and the soft rustle of imperial silks. So when the Emperor's personal bodyguard, a hulking Vorlon known only as the Sentinel, leaned in to speak, the act itself was a transgression. The Vorlon's voice was a low, gravelly vibration, a sound never meant for words. "I have been studying their history, sire," he whispered, the confession hanging in the air like a ghost. "They have a saying, the flame that burns twice as bright burns half as long." The Sentinel paused, letting the ancient human wisdom settle. Perhaps their chaos is not strength, but a frantic race toward extinction. For a single, breathtaking moment, a flicker of cold, cruel hope ignited within Zalthor's heart. It was an elegant thought, a logical one. Such explosive, unsustainable creativity must inevitably consume itself. Humanity was a supernova, brilliant and brief. His empire was a red dwarf, steady and eternal. All he had to do was wait. His many eyes swept across his desk, past glowing star charts and tactical readouts, and came to rest on the one object that defied categorization. The Rubik's Cube, its colored squares remained in their stubborn, chaotic disarray. He had not solved it, he had not even come close, and in that simple, plastic puzzle, he saw the fatal flaw in the Sentinel's logic. A supernova does not leave behind a puzzle, it leaves behind dust and radiation. A supernova does not baffle its enemies with child's toys and economic paradoxes. It simply annihilates them. Humanity's flame was not a wild, careless burn headed for an early end. It was a forge fire, unpredictable and hot, constantly melting down old realities to hammer them into new, unexpected shapes. They were not racing toward extinction, they were evolving through it over and over again, their entire history a testament to the art of bouncing back from the brink. How do you outlast an enemy whose entire culture is built on the principle of creative renewal? The cold hope in his heart sputtered and died, replaced by a colder dread. The Sentinel had offered him a comforting lie, but the unsolved cube on his desk told a much more terrifying truth. The news anchor on the screen grinned, shaking her head as the imperial decree scrolled past. "So we are officially the weird neighbors they are afraid to talk to," she said with a laugh. "Works for me." The broadcast then cut to a compilation of cats slipping off couches and tumbling from bookshelves, set to a cheerful, absurd musical score. It was a 10-minute segment of pure, unadulterated human whimsy. This blooper reel, this celebration of clumsy failure, did something no human diplomatic communique ever could. It bypassed imperial firewalls and cultural filters with the ease of a virus, spreading through data streams to screens on a dozen core worlds. Imperial citizens, conditioned to value grace and perfection, watched the clips in stunned silence. They saw creatures seemingly beloved by humans engaging in humiliating and utterly pointless acts of physical comedy, and the humans found this hilarious. There was no logic to it, no lesson, no moral. It was joy derived from chaos itself. The videos became an unexpected, subversive hit. In the grey corridors of imperial stations, workers would share a quick, silent glance and a subtle hand gesture mimicking a cat's fall. It was not a political statement. It was a shared, secret joke about the universe's inherent silliness, a concept their own culture had never permitted. How do you maintain a society built on solemn dignity when the most popular import from your most feared adversary is a video of a kitten getting tangled in a ball of yarn? The Empire had feared human weapons and human ideas, but it was utterly unprepared for the weaponized power of a good laugh. The Galactic Empire, a civilization that once cast its shadow across 1,000,000 stars, now lives in the permanent twilight of a single, small world. Its colossal fleets patrol borders far from the blue marble of Earth, its economic policies carefully designed to avoid any entanglement with human markets, its cultural censors working overtime to filter out the latest viral trends. The story of this great conflict ends not with a climactic battle or a formal surrender, but with the unsettling quiet of a stalemate born from a profound and permanent fear. In his silent throne room, Emperor Zalthor the Unbending, the master of the greatest military force ever assembled, spends his days not studying star charts of new conquests but staring at a child's toy. The Rubik's Cube sits on his obsidian desk, its colors still stubbornly out of alignment, a constant and silent testament to the one truth that now defines his entire reign. He does not fear human weapons, for he can build bigger ones. He does not fear their fleets, for he can muster more. The only thing this emperor of 1,000,000 worlds truly, irrevocably fears is the boundless, unpredictable creativity of the Earthlings, a force of nature against which no empire, no matter how mighty or ancient, can ever truly prepare. The cube is not just a puzzle, it is a monument to his own limitation, a quiet acknowledgement that some forces in the universe are not meant to be conquered, only witnessed with a kind of terrified awe. How do you rule a galaxy when your greatest legacy is the one enemy you were wise enough to leave alone?